So, good evening, everyone. I'm sending you all greetings on the behalf of Bosnia Herzegovina Futures Foundation, and I wish you all welcome to our eighth webinar so far. So, we have a very special guest this evening. His name is Amer Grgic, and he's a CTO or Chief Technology Officer at Tevreden in Netherlands. And he will be talking about how can you build your software product and bring it to the market. So Amer, welcome to the Futures webinar series, and thank you so much for 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 attending here.
No problem. Thank you a lot for the invitation. It was a bit on short notice, but that's no problem at all. I would like to thank you for having a great series like this, and I hope that a lot of people will have something from this webinar.
So you can begin now with the presentation.
Sure. No problem. Everybody, welcome. What I would like to do is I'm going to talk about how to build your first software product. We've done that, and when I say I'm talking about Tevreden.nl. We've done this a lot over the last few years, and I would like to just share the things that we came across when we were building these software products. So what I would like to do, and I would like to start with, is a little bit of a backstory. So the backstory behind what we are doing is Tevreden.nl is a satisfaction research company, and we send out surveys. So we send out surveys to all kinds of clients and collect the data from those surveys and actually return that to our clients as well. So what's our problem? How did we actually start working on a product? So return that to our clients. What our problem is that we have an application that's an older application. It's actually more than 10 years old, and everybody that's in the software space knows that having an application that's running for more than 10 years is actually not the best way to have an application. You would really like to uh, every few years start working on something new, or actually have something that's going to replace the older application. So we came to a conclusion that the old application wasn't cutting it anymore, and if we wanted to compete with others, we should probably start working on something new. So when you have that decision to do that, that's a pretty hefty decision, because you're really looking at, okay, do we really want to do this? Because this is our core business. Everything that's running is actually from that particular application. So when we were doing that, is you have a decision that you almost always have to make, and the decision that you need to make is the buy or build decision. You need to pick one. You basically need to see, okay, is there something on the market that I could buy right now to solve my problem and to have a new application without building it ourselves? So that's something that was the first step, of course, to see, okay, what's on the market right now that we could buy to replace our old software that we have. And the interesting part here is that the more we were looking at it, the more we were like, okay, this is not going to work, because a lot of the things that we have in our application are very specific and very interesting for our clients, and that's also the reason why they chose us. That was those specific things that were in the old application. And to the other things that you're also looking at when you're doing a buy or build decision is, okay, if I buy this, what does that mean for some kinds of things like control, right? You're basically saying, okay, we're giving our core business, our core application, to someone else to build, and that's of course comes with some trade-offs. You need to at least have a very good relationship with the company you're buying from, but also what does it mean when some client, for example, has a feature that's not in that application? Do they build that in, or maybe they don't want to build that in because it goes against what they want to build as a product. So that's kind of always the decision that you have to make within those first steps. The interesting thing as well, to reframe that, the buying would be when you look at it, in most cases would be cheaper, because you would probably buy some license or whatever. So that's usually cheaper than building it yourself, because you need a longer period of time to, of course, build it. So when we were making that decision, we were like, okay, do we want to make those trade-offs? So if we don't make those trade-offs, that basically means that we need to build it ourselves, which we were doing all these years, even before I came to work at Tevreden.nl. So it's always a trade-off, and we were hesitant to do the buy because, one, we didn't see a good fit with the products that were on the market, but also we like to have that control, and that's also what clients expect from us, is that when they do have a feature request, we usually can pick that up pretty quickly and build it into our system that we have right now. So that buy or build decision is a big one. So we took the harder route, if I can call it like that, and we did building. So that's basically the decision that you maybe start off with, even when you want to replace an old system. So when you build a new system, that's a different thing, of course. So when you're building your own first software product, it's probably because you're building something that you want to make because you see a market for it or whatever. So usually you will get to this decision as well, and you will probably say, okay, do the build thing, unless it's something that you're going to resell. So if you're going to resell, I don't know, there are a lot of software packages on the market right now that you can resell, where you can say, okay, I want to resell this Power BI license, for example, or whatever. So for us, this was the easiest decision to make. So when you make that decision, you automatically go to a building phase, and you probably need to know, okay, what's it going to take to create that? And usually you will need some kind of a team who's going to build it, right? It's rare to see someone that has multiple facets of, and the business side, and someone that's technical and that can build a product and do the sales and do the marketing and stuff like that. So even without those things, you still need someone that's going to build it. If that's by yourself, there are a lot of entrepreneurs that actually do this, that can do these things, at least some of these things, by themselves. And then they're like, okay, I'm just going to pick it up myself, build it, and then go further with it. So what is interesting is that we were like, okay, we need to build, and we need to have a team. We need to have people that are going to do that. So why did we decide that? The thing was that we were like, okay, these are the things that we didn't do before. We didn't build a product before, and we were like, okay, we need to have people that can actually do this and can actually deliver on this product. So the first thing that we look at when you're building a team, in most cases, is what are you bad at? So what are you, as a leader, or the team leader, what are you bad at? And the reason I'm asking that, also to myself, is I know for a fact that I'm not a developer. It's not the background that I have, and that means that you need to have great developers that are going to build this. If I was going to build it, it would probably, with a lot of work, it would probably work, but it wouldn't be a great experience for anybody. So you need to look at those things. What are some of the characteristics that you don't have, that you want to have other people uh, that are going to join in? So say, for instance, you're a great developer, but you don't do design work, or you don't do front end work, or you don't do UX or whatever. I mean, those are the key parts that you're going to look at. What are the things that are going to complement me to get this to uh, a specific point, this software product in this case? So when I look at that, is okay, I needed developers, but I also know that a lot of developers don't have those design skills. So you also need to look at, okay, if I need that, what am I going to do? Do I need a full-time designer? Do I need a freelance designer? What's the catch here? What is it that I'm going to select? And that's a key point. Always look at others that are going to complement your characteristics that you have. For example, I know that I love to have a team and build a team, and also get that team to work the best they can. So that's something that I don't need to have in the team. I just need someone that is going to be supportive of that, and also do the right things at the right time. So when we look at our situation, for example, we have two developers that are working from Serbia. One is a senior and one is a media developer. And the reason is I can totally trust the guy on the other side, the senior in our case, to make the right decisions. He can make the decisions on the development, on development. And for me, that's nice, because I can actually trust the person on the other side. I can say, okay, I trust your judgment. So this is what we need to build. This is also how it will probably work. But I'm trusting you to actually make the right choices in terms of architecture, in terms of technology stack, and stuff like that. So after that, you will probably need to look at what is actually important to you. So what are some of the key characteristics that you need to look at within those people? Of course, it's good to have a great designer, but if there are other things that they cannot do correctly, and that's also tying into the next slide as well, is you always need to look at some skills, right? So you have the soft skills with our of course communication. How does someone work inside of a team? But also the hard skills. So when what's good about this developer, right? The hard skills are usually easier to learn over time than the communication, because if someone just can't communicate but they are a great developer, for me that's not going to work, because that's something that I need in my team. I need a strong communicator, so that when, for example, they make a decision, as sometimes the senior or the media does, I need to know why they made that decision, because in some cases I need to explain it to someone else as well. Why did we make the decision to go for this framework, or go for this particular programming language? What are some of the advantages of choosing that over something else? Because that's ultimately what it comes down to. A lot of people in the business won't care, because they are like, okay, it just needs to work. And that's something that's very important to note, is especially when you're working with a remote team. So the soft skills are even more important in that case, because you're not having like constant communication with each other. Of course, you have to chat, you have the daily stand-ups that you do. Then daily stand-ups are just 15 to 30 minutes, where you just talk about what you did yesterday, what you're going to do today. But those are key ingredients to me to look at, and I always pick the soft skills over those hard skills, because I feel that if your soft skills are good enough, if you have that eagerness, that hunger to learn new things, then those hard skills will come eventually. So that's also a very tricky thing, but I always choose the first one, where when I see that someone's hungry for new things, they really want to learn it, I will pick that person over someone that has hard skills but no soft skills at all. So uh, when you have these things, you've basically created your team, or you're starting on it yourself. You also need to look at, okay, what's going to be my V1, as I call it. So that's just the first version. What is that? And how do you define that? So the V1, in my opinion, is the first version of your product that you can actually release to someone, and actually someone else can use. So that's very important. It's you've maybe heard of the term MVP, or a minimal viable product. I, 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 it's a normal term that a lot of people use, but it has got some slack, because a lot of people think that a minimal viable product is like a prototype and not something that you can release to the public. So I tend to use V1. For a lot of people that hear it the first time, they're like, okay, what is that? Um, and to me, it's a marketable product, but it's still lacks in maybe some extra features that someone would like to have, but it does have the essential features in it. When you define that, when you say, okay, this is my V1, the most important thing that you're going to do after that is that you look at your scope. So the scope of a product or the scope of your V1 is extremely important, because you're going to look at what are the kind of key features that I really need to have, and when you do that, you will probably still have features that are excess, even though you think you've cut enough from your scope. It's always good to, even when you do that, even go further than that and say, okay, even this we don't really need to have in the first version. To give you an example, say for instance you want to be able to have the client upload their logo and show it in a questionnaire in our case. Well, that's a very interesting thing, but is it completely necessary for a first version? Some people would say yes, but we've seen that building in these kinds of things, it 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 sometimes gives more complexity than you actually need in a first version. And it's good to be very, very critical on, okay, do we really need this? Because in the end, this is kind of your first version, and that's what all the other things are going to be built upon. So when you do that, when you define your scope, when you think, okay, we've got all the things that we really need to have, still be critical of, okay, is this, every time you build something, is this really, really critical to have? If it's not, you can better scrap it and look at it maybe at a later time. So write that down, that you probably want to have that in maybe a second version or third version. So when we look at our scope in our particular case for our software product, so we knew that we needed some basic stuff. So one of the basic things was, okay, you need to be able to sign up. So you need to be able to sign up for an account on our side and go further with that. Another thing is, of course, when you do the sign up, you need to be able to log in. So that's something that we also were like, okay, these are key points. The next thing is user management. So user management was for us a very important part, because we wanted to make some collaboration happen within those accounts. So we were like, okay, someone should be able to manage those users in their own account. And that's one of the things that later on I was like, maybe I could have even cut that out of the first version. I could have even said, okay, in the first version, there is no collaboration. You just have your own account and that's it. So even after we actually built it in, I was like, we could have done without that in the first version. So even I wasn't critical enough of the first version that we were building. So we knew that we needed to be able to create surveys, forms, however you want to call them, and we needed to manage them. So we needed to have spaces where they could be created and stuff like that. And of course, you needed to be able to create those forms. So we were looking at, okay, these are the key components for us. So without these things, you can't even start collecting data. Then the next, of course, is actually collecting the data. So you need to be able to see that form, fill it in, and submit your response. So you need to be able to collect those responses so you can output the data. And that's the last part, where you were like, okay, we need to have exporting as well. So exporting in our case can be in multiple variants. So you have exporting in PDF, for example. And we were like, okay, do we really need that for a first version? Because the most important part here is the data. So if you can get that in an Excel, that's usually enough for all the people that are going to use the system. So we were like, okay, let's just focus on the exporting to Excel, which we built in pretty quickly. But it's the essential part of what we want to do with exporting. So basically, here is the first version in just a few bullet points. Of course, these are all kinds of issues that are surrounding those kind of epics, if you can call them like that. So epics are a collection of these kind of stories, and that brings it to the next point, where how do you actually know which things you want to pick up? So we use a process called user story mapping, and user stories are basically a user can do X. So for example, if you want to log in, a user should be able to log in. And what does a user need to log in? They need to have a password field, and they need to have, for example, their email field, because that's their account name. So that's the way you kind of build up those user stories. So when you look at user story mapping, the interesting part is that you start from a user's perspective, where you say, okay, a user should be able to do a product search, for example, in this example. And then you start at the top, and the top is basically the biggest form, so an epic, as they call it in some cases. And below that, you actually start to do the user stories themselves. So someone should be able to filter by category, sort by price, or whatever. And that's the way you work down. And in some cases, some people even put like swimming lanes over this process, where they say, okay, this is my V1, this is my V2, I need to have these things in my V2. But that's usually it's usually enough to focus on your V1. So the process that we went through was that I went to see the developers in Serbia, and we had a full week where we were just doing this. So we're just thinking about, okay, what do we need to have? What are kind of the settings that are needed to get to this point? So that's the way we thought it out. And of course, we just made pictures of that. And in the end, you create, for example, if you use GitHub or GitLab to build your projects, you can just create issues, and those issues will be picked up once you start working on the project. That also brings me to the next point. Some of you may have heard for what Scrum is, or Kanban. So Scrum, for the people that don't know, you have in Scrum to have the basic idea. You have like you have sprints. They're called sprints every 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks, you pick up multiple of those user stories and try to finish them within that sprint. And the idea is that at the end of those 2 weeks, you should be able to have a new kind of release that you can do and go further with. And the other one is Kanban, which is mostly without that kind of time frame. You're not doing that sprint every 2 weeks. And we started with Scrum actually, and later on we were like, okay, but this is a little bit too much overhead for the size of the team that we have. So our team is usually like 3 or 4 or 5 people. So for us, Kanban, which is just picking up the next thing that's in our backlog, that worked better for us. But for the bigger teams, you'll probably see Scrum a lot because it gives you a great definition of what you're going to have in your next release. So that's a personal preference that you can pick up. Then we'll pick your first challenge. So what are you going to start with? So what are you going to actually pick up the first in the kind of first release of your first version? And that all comes down to what you're actually building. So if you're building, in our instance, this application for forms and surveys and stuff like that, that meant like, okay, we need to look at the users first. So the users things like the sign up, the login, we need to get that right to at least have that kind of basic version that someone can log in, and then afterwards they can do stuff with the forms, manage that. And then afterwards have the form builder and then the exporting, because that's the logical transition that the user goes through as well in their user journey. So it's good to start at the beginning and see, okay, am I building something that has a login function? You will probably in the end need to start with that. But it really depends on what kind of system you're building. But in our case, it was that we were like, okay, we need to we focus on this. This needs to be the best experience that someone has. So they need to be able to sign up really easily and go through that process. Then another question that gets asked a lot. So how do you pick your technology stack? we do a kind of practical implementation of picking our technology. So of course you look at your team. What are they proficient in? If they are good in Java, for example, it's probably good to look at that and see, okay, is Java, for example, a good pick for what we are going to build? So that's also the way we look at it. So for example, we need to collect responses. Okay, what's the best kind of thing that we can find right now that we can use and we can start working with? And that's kind of always the thing that we kind of look at. It's not we don't have a bias for a particular language or whatever. We just need to look at, okay, what are we going to build and what's the most appropriate thing to use for that. Maybe the thing that we're using right now is not appropriate for the actual thing that we want to build. So when be critical of that and not let your biases run yourself in that case. So if you really love PHP, for example, but you're building something that could be better done in Python, you should probably think about if you really want to use PHP, even though you're more proficient in it. So that's something that I wanted to give along with the technology stack. And to get back to the V1 is your base, and I compare it to a foundation of your house as well, where this is the essential part of what you're going to build later. So if this V1 is not the way it has to be, you have all kinds of things that don't add to the value of the actual customer. You will usually see that along the way, and if you don't create that first base correctly, you will see that will also have impact on the future versions that you're going to create of your product. And also, V1 is not a proof of concept in that case. So as I said, it should be your first working actual version of the application, and that's a very important thing. So a proof of concept is usually just something that you build very quickly just to show that it will actually work, and it's not something that you would like to show to the public or let people sign up to and stuff like that. Then when you do that, when you actually have that first version, that's the next step. You need to collect your feedback. So the reason why I'm saying that is that you need to look at, okay, we've built this, but we kind of have an idea of the things that we need to do in the second release. But it's always good to collect that feedback from others and say, okay, what is actually the thing that we need to build next? Because if you don't listen to your customers in that sense, you will probably end up building stuff that they don't need, but there are other things that they really need and you're not building them. So try to collect that feedback. You can collect that in multiple ways. There are a lot of software products on the market that can actually do this for you. You can also put in a chat, for example, in your application. We're doing that with another application that we have, where people can actually ask the questions inside of that chat, but also do some suggestions if they want to. But try to collect that in one place. So when you see, for example, 5 people say, okay, I need that export in PDF, that means that you would probably need to put that issue a little bit higher up the list. So look at that. So there is, as I said, a lot of technology that you can work with, and try to use that. Try to use that thing, the technology that you can have for collecting that feedback. And also for us, it is, we do forms, so why not do it through our own forms, stuff like that. So you will need that, you will see that later on as well, where you need to collect that feedback. It's very important to check up on that. Another thing, checking with trial users. For in our product, we have trial users where someone registers and they have 30 days to test the product. Check up on them, because those are the people that will actually give you the reasons why they don't pick a product, but also why they pick the product. So it's good in both ways. It's good to see the ones that actually become a paying customer, but also the ones that don't do that. And that's very important for future things that you're going to build and future customers that you want to onboard in your product. So check in with them on a regular basis. A lot of companies do that through, for example, intercom, where they after, for example, 7 days, they will send you an email. Okay, how is it going, and stuff like that. But also you can do that through that chat that you have. And yeah, eat your own dog food, and that's basically it. When we're building a form builder, use the form for feedback. If you're already doing that, why not use it and try to fit that into the process as well. And what I want to say is that you need to just start, because if you don't start it, if you don't start working on the product that you want to build, you will probably not know if it will work. So take that into consideration, that whenever you want to build something, you should start with it and see if it works. If it doesn't work, and of course if you didn't try, you won't know if it will actually work in the real world. So that's the last thing that I wanted to say is if you start, you will see if it will work. Otherwise you won't. You can think about theories all you want, but if you don't start building it, you won't get anywhere. So that's the webinar. You can find me on these specific things, so on the Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Of course, I have a podcast that maybe some of you already listened to, but if you want to, I'm talking to all kinds of people within the industry about these things, but also leadership and all kinds of other things. And I would like to thank you for listening. And I think there are probably some questions, so I'll let Amina get to them.
Thank you, Amer. It has been great to hear this presentation, especially from an angle of an electrical engineering student and a software engineering student. So we have some questions. First question is from our the chair of our foundation, Edhem Custovic, and he asks, how do we self-reflect and actually determine that we are not so good at something? Often we can overlook weaknesses because we don't have a benchmark for our skills.
Yeah, that's a good question, Eddie. Thanks for your question. Usually, what I'll do as well. I usually check up on what we're doing with others as well, which are not inside of the project. That's one of the things that I'm very critical of, is that when I, for example, do a demo to our entire company with people that don't on a daily basis look at what we're building at the moment. That's one particular point that I think that's really easy to implement for anyone, to show it to people that are not inside of your project group that you're building it for, or people that you know. So say, for instance, you're looking at you have a kind of first version of your product. Show it to people that you know, and see what they actually think about it. So that's it's hard to be critical of yourself. I try to do it myself, and that's sometimes harder, because it's good to hear from others what the actual feedback is. So what I do is every 2 weeks, usually every 2 weeks, sometimes once a month, I will show our progress and show what we are building at that time. And after that, we'll say, okay, this is actually something that we should focus on, because a lot of people are getting used to it. But even then, we still look through some kind of if you can say, you still look at it from an angle that we're a research company, so we're looking at it from our perspective, and that's not the end user in all cases. So try and if you already have clients, it's good to talk with them as well. But if you don't have them yet, try and explain it to someone else that's not in that particular group or in that particular sector, and see what they actually think about it. So say they will say, okay, these are very interesting things, but I don't know what you're getting at. I don't know what you actually want to achieve with your product. Then you need to know that you need to rethink that again. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Okay, thank you, Amer. The second question comes from our mentor, Miralim Salihovic. Can you please elaborate more on why V1 versus MVP? For me, it is always crucial to get to an MVP state as soon as possible, because of the UAT feedback we can capture and introduce into the V1 of the product?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks, Miralam. I think there is not much difference between an MVP and a V1, and maybe it's also just semantics, because basically the V1 for me is something that I can market as well. And in some cases, an MVP you can market, but you also can't. It depends on what you define as an MVP on your side. So there are not many differences between them, but I like to use the V1 because what I hear from some people as well is when I talk about an MVP, they're like, yeah, that's a prototype. That's not something that we're really going to release, and you still need to do a lot of work on. So I try to use a different term for something that's maybe an MVP in your case, but in our case, I try to differentiate that a little bit by using a different thing. So I hope that answers the question a little bit. But it doesn't differ from it a lot. But I use it as something else that makes it a little bit more clear for someone to explain. So I can say, okay, a V1 is this and this and this. But you could probably do that with an MVP as well, where you say, okay, I know that you think an MVP is kind of a prototype, but I see it as this and this and this, maybe something that I can market or whatever. So that's kind of maybe the differentiation that you can make through to those two. So it's a little bit of a semantic thing, but I hope that that answers the question a little bit.
Okay, another question from our mentee and scholar, Amer Grgic. What is the best way to estimate how much time it takes for a team to develop a certain feature or to complete a user story?
Yeah, great question, Damir. So what happens a lot in Scrum, usually in Scrum, is that when they are in that process of doing those sprints, you will actually assign points to those particular issues, where a point can be ranging from 1 to 13 usually. I think there is even a debate about what that number should actually be, but and where for example 1 point would be the least complex thing to build, and 13 for example would be the most complex thing that would probably take multiple sprints to complete. So it's hard to estimate because that's the same thing as working on a V1. Someone will say, okay, how long is it going to take for you to build that V1? And I say 6 months, for example, but maybe it isn't 6 months. It's a little bit harder to estimate that because it's over a bigger project. So if you're looking at an issue, it's usually good to start working with those points, because what happens is over multiple sprints you will actually see how many points you can do within, and of course if your estimates were good, but also how many points you can burn as a team within that sprint, within those 2 weeks. So say for instance you have 2 developers and they can both burn 20 points or something like that. It's a little bit rough estimation, but say.
Okay, the next question comes from our mentor, Miralim Salhovic again. Do you prefer Agile, Scrum versus Waterfall or Cannibal, and why? Did you hear me?
When are we going to do that? When are we going to get to that point?
Did you hear my question?
No, I didn't. No.
Okay. It is from our mentor, Miralim again. Do you prefer
Sure.
Agile, Scrum versus Waterfall or Cannibal, and why?
Yeah, it's a good question. As I mentioned before, for us, it's usually it's the common method, but that's more because we saw that works better for us. So the real answer here is, do you think that there is a big there's no big difference between it. It's just a matter of preference. A lot of people will say, okay, I'm just going to do Scrum because that's going to work. There's something to say for that, but sometimes it's also good to look at, okay, maybe we've picked Scrum, but if we do it the other way, for us it came naturally. For example, for us it came naturally to switch to Kanban instead of just doing it doing it through Scrum. But you should be critical of yourself as well and see, okay, is this really working for us over a longer period of time? So there is no there is no real bad choice in this. It's just a matter of preference in that.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Damir again. How to recognize that our team has too much overhead while practicing Scrum? When do meetings start to give diminishing returns?
Yeah. So great question, because we saw that ourselves. So how we did that was that we were seeing that, of course, when you do Scrum, for example, you have those kind of retrospectives every 2 weeks, where you're like, okay, every 2 weeks after the sprint, you look at, okay, what went well, what are things that we need to optimize and stuff like that. What we saw was that when we tried to release everything that we're doing. So for example, if we picked up an issue, we wanted to release that as well. And that means that if you are doing that, you're automatically already kind of moving away from the whole idea of sprints. Of course, you can do it within sprints as well. It's up to you. But to get to that point, you're doing that through those retrospectives as well, where we're like, okay, but we're doing some arbitrary meetings every 2 weeks, sprint planning and stuff like that, and we're seeing like some issues just take longer than that sprint, and we don't really need to go through that whole process of replanning everything, seeing if something still needs to be in the sprint and stuff like that. So for us, it as I said, it was a kind of natural process, but you need to look at it from a perspective of the team. So and say, okay, is this really working for us? That's basically the question you need to ask. Is this still working for us in the way that we're doing it right now? If that answer is maybe or no, you should probably look at that process as well. And to measure your overhead, we didn't really measure it. It's just that we saw that when we switched and when we said, okay, let's try it, let's see how it will work if we do Kanban, uh, we saw that we were getting more issues out than we were doing inside of those sprints, and we were less uh, time bound in that sense, where we're like, okay, we really need to finish this sprint, or we really need to do this, and focus on just the quality over just getting things out in that sprint window, if you can call it like that. So that's basically the way we did it.
Okay. The next question comes from Momčilo Amovic. He was scholar at our foundation.
Yeah, it was my mentee.
Yeah, I know. Does agile development depends on customers' needs? Is it possible to do every project with agile principles, no matter what our customers request?
Yeah, it's a great question. It comes down to preference. Some people swear by the waterfall method, some swear by the agile method. But you really need to think about, okay, is this going to solve something that we want to do? If for example, those sprints are going to help you get more structured because you have a bigger team, and then you get more things done, great. If it works for you, use it by all means. But if a client does it, it's a little bit harder, because you're looking at it from a client perspective, and they're like, yeah, you really need to do sprints, and you're like, okay, but why? Because we're seeing that this other thing is actually working better. You need to have that fair discussion of saying, okay, if you can show it by numbers and say we're doing more by using something different than Scrum, or we're doing more by using something different than waterfall, that basically means that you have something there. So you need to be able to come up with those, maybe with those numbers as well, but also look at it from a standpoint of the team. The team functions better if we do it this way. So why should we do something that will probably ruin the team dynamic in that sense? So look at it from that perspective as well, where you always need to look at your team that you have there. For some people, it works better to do it this way. Some people, it works better to do it this way. But you need to be able to say that to someone, and to have that fair discussion with the client, for example. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay. The next question comes from Kenan Grgic. He would like to know more about the tools you use for task organization. How do you keep track in the team who needs to do what and when? some particular
Sure.
software you would recommend?
Yeah. So software recommendations. Some people use Jira, for example. Jira is pretty much the de facto standard that a lot of people use. We do it a little bit differently because we, as I said, we don't really need that overhead of those, if you can call it overhead, but we don't need those arbitrary sprints and stuff like that. So what we do, we have GitLab for our code repositories and stuff like that. And within the GitLab, we actually have boards where you can see, okay, this is currently what's in the doing column. This is what's in review, where another developer needs to review what another developer did. Then it goes through the testing phase, and then in the end, we're actually going to push it to production. So we use basically all of our things are in GitLab. So we have the code repositories in there. We have the issues in there with which we are working on in a kind of in swimming lanes where you can see, okay, this is where that particular issue is within the process. And we also do our builds within GitLab. So if we have a new release, we just click a particular button, and it will actually build it for us and deploy that new release. So we use GitLab, but in the end, again, it's kind of a recurring theme. But we've used GitHub before, we've used Jira before, and we came to a conclusion that this works for us. And then you kind of stick with that. And one thing that we were particularly fond of is that it's all in one place, and that can't be underestimated. Of course, you can use Jira with Bitbucket, their own code repository, and have everything in one place. But it's still kind of not all in one place because, for example, my builds will be in some different software. So we use GitLab, and I'm very happy that we made that switch. I think we made that switch maybe a year ago, something like that, and not look back since, actually, after that.
Thank you. So we have another question that just came in from Alexander Stoisavlevich. What is your opinion on everlasting debate? Technical tasks infrastructure visible in Sprint or not, like setting up CI/CD pipelines?
So the question is probably if you need to have that inside of your project as an issue. I think that maybe Alexander can clarify it a little bit, but I think that's what he is referring to. Yeah, it's a tough question because is it something that's actually within the application? Some people would say yes, of course, and other people would say not really, because it's more a release management or continuous deployment and stuff like that. So for us, we I think we did when we built it, we actually made issues for it inside of the project, and we were like, okay, this is something that we need to implement, so we're going to do it. So we did it ourselves. We did it inside of the project, but I can understand that some people will say, okay, it doesn't really need to live inside of that project. But maybe you can clarify it a little bit. I hope this is what you were referring to.
Thank you, Amer. We don't have any questions left, so it
Sure.
has been a great webinar, and I wish you all good evening or a nice day if you are watching this from another time zone. Good night.
Thank you.